Arizona Territory, late spring of 1879. The sun scorched the San Pedro Valley, casting long shadows across a small adobe home where 32-year-old Turok, a widowed Apache warrior, leaned against the doorframe. His dark eyes traced the horizon, where a faint dust trail signaled a wagon's approach from Tucson. His heart thudded, a mix of hope and unease he couldn't shake. His sons, Cale, 7, and Moreau, 5, darted through the yard, their laughter weaving through the rustle of mesquite trees. They had no idea what was coming. Turok's fingers brushed a worn letter tucked in his belt, its words, scribed with a missionary's help, having traveled to Missouri and brought back a promise. A woman, a stranger, had agreed to join him and his boys. He hadn't wanted to send for her. For months, he'd brushed off the elder's advice that his sons needed a mother's care. But the raid last autumn had stolen his wife, Liana, in a brutal flash, leaving their home hollow. He'd buried her beneath a cottonwood, her grave marked by a single stone, while Cale and Moreau clung to him, tears streaking their faces. Turok had fought to keep their world steady, hunting, tending a small corn plot, teaching the boys to track. But he couldn't fill the quiet where Liana's songs once lingered. So, he'd written, asking for someone strong and gentle to raise his half-Apache sons in a world that often scorned them. And she had said yes. The wagon creaked to a stop near the adobe. Turok stepped forward, moccasins silent on the packed earth. The driver, a grizzled trader, tipped his hat and helped a woman down. She was slight, her frame wrapped in a faded calico dress, black hair pulled into a tight braid. She gripped a small satchel, knuckles pale, and when her dark eyes met his, they held a flicker of fear, quickly masked. Turok approached, voice steady but soft. "You must be Clara." She nodded, lips pressed tight. "Clara Ruiz," she said, her voice barely carrying over the breeze. He offered his hand. "Turok, thank you for coming." Her hand trembled as it touched his, her gaze darting to the boys now watching from behind a stack of firewood. "I've never been this far west," she murmured. "I figured," Turok said, a faint warmth in his tone. "But you came." Clara's eyes fell to the ground. "There was nothing left for me in Missouri." Turok nodded, understanding more than he said. He gestured toward the boys. "That's Cale, the older one. Miro's the small one. They're curious, a bit wild, but they've got good hearts." Clara looked at them, her expression unreadable. "Their mother?" she asked softly. "Gone," Turok said, voice tightening. "Last fall. A raid." Clara didn't press further, just watched the boys, who stared back, wary but intrigued. Turok led Clara into the adobe, the boys trailing behind, whispering to each other. The home was simple, earthen walls, a small wooden table, a hearth where embers glowed faintly, giving off the scent of sage. Clara stood in the doorway, her eyes moving over the woven blankets draped over a bench, the clay pots lined on a shelf, the faint dust settled in the corners. Turok pointed to a curtained corner. "I made a space for you. It's yours. Take your time." Clara glanced at him, her grip still tight on her satchel. "You sent for a wife." Turok met her gaze, unflinching. "I sent for help. The rest can wait." She studied him for a moment, something shifting in her dark eyes. "Most men wouldn't say that." He shrugged, a small gesture. "I'm not most men." She nodded, and when Turok reached for her satchel, she hesitated, then let him take it. He carried it to her corner, setting it gently on the packed dirt floor. The boys hovered near the doorway, Cale nudging Moreau, who clutched a small wooden horse carved by his father. That night, Clara helped settle the boys, her hands unsteady as she tucked a blanket around Moreau. She hummed a soft tune, one she'd learned as a child in Missouri, and Cale leaned closer, watching her with open curiosity. When she finished, Moreau whispered, "You sing quiet like Mama." Clara paused, her breath catching, then smiled faintly. "Thank you." Turok, standing in the shadows of the hall, said nothing, but his chest eased slightly, a knot loosening he hadn't known was there. In the kitchen, Clara lingered by the hearth, fingers tracing the edge of a clay cup. The firelight cast her shadow long against the wall. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Turok nodded, stepping closer but keeping his distance. "I know." She looked up, her eyes searching his. "Why are you kind to me?" He held her gaze, steady and worn. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything." They stood in silence, the fire crackling softly. Clara sat at the table, and Turok poured her a cup of tea from a kettle on the hearth. She sipped it slowly, the warmth steadying her hands. They didn't say much more that night, but when she went to her corner, she left the curtain slightly open. By morning, Clara rose before the sun, finding a broom leaning against the wall. She swept the packed dirt floor, the rhythm calming her nerves. She boiled cornmeal for gruel, the smell drawing the boys from their blankets. Cale called her Miss Clara, his voice testing the words, while Moreau watched, clutching his wooden horse. Turok came in from checking his traps, hair damp with morning mist, a faint scent of mesquite clinging to him. "You didn't have to cook," he said, setting a small bundle of herbs on the table. "I wanted to," Clara replied, placing plates before the boys. When Moreau spilled his water, she wiped it up without a word, her movements steady. Days turned to weeks in the San Pedro Valley, the sun climbing higher as spring gave way to early summer. Clara learned the land's rhythm, how to grind corn with a stone metate, how to spot patches of prickly pear hidden among the scrub. She moved quietly through her tasks, her hands growing steadier with each passing day. Turok showed her how to mend a broken fence, his calloused fingers guiding hers over the wire with a patience that surprised her. They worked side by side, the silence between them comfortable, broken only by the hum of insects or the distant call of a hawk. One afternoon, as they repaired a section of fence under the blazing sun, Clara spoke, her voice soft against the rustle of mesquite. "In Missouri I sewed for a tailor. Watched people pass by the shop window all day. I thought I'd miss it." Turok paused, leaning on a post, his dark eyes catching hers. "Do you?" She shook her head, wiping sweat from her brow. "Not the way I thought. I just don't know where I belong yet." He looked out at the valley, its vastness stretching to the horizon. "You will." Evenings brought new routines. After supper, the boys played with stones by the hearth, arranging them into shapes while Clara mended Cale's torn shirt, her needle moving in precise stitches. Turok sat nearby, sharpening a knife or weaving a small basket from yucca fibers. One night, he looked up, his voice low. "Can you teach them to read?" Clara's hands stilled. "I can try." She began with simple words, scratching them into the dirt with a stick. Cale picked up the letters quickly, his brow furrowed in concentration, while Moreau preferred drawing shapes beside them. Turok watched from the doorway, saying little, but the next day he carved a small slate from a flat stone and left it on the table for her to use. Clara took to walking the valley in the afternoons, a woven basket on her arm for gathering herbs and wild berries. She found a patch of cholla buds near a dry wash, and brought back enough to dry for winter. Turok didn't ask what she planned to do with them. He sharpened her small knife and left a clay pot by the hearth. The boys followed her sometimes, Cale asking questions about plants, Moreau trailing behind with a stick to poke at rocks. One evening, Clara found a small clay figure on her blanket, a rough carving of a woman with a braid. No note, but Cale's shy grin the next morning told her it was his. When Moreau fell ill with a rattling cough, Clara stayed by his side, soaking scraps of cloth in cool water and laying them across his fevered forehead. She counted his breaths, her voice low as she whispered songs from her childhood. Cale sat nearby, unusually quiet, clutching his brother's hand. Turok brought water, his face tight with worry. "You've seen this before?" he asked, voice low. Clara's eyes stayed on Moreau. "My brother," she said softly. "He didn't make it, but I know what to watch for." Turok didn't question her further. He boiled cloths, hauled water, and sat outside the room, his head in his hands, until Clara called him back. By nightfall, Moreau's fever broke, his breath steady. Clara stayed until he slept, his fingers curled around the edge of a quilt she'd mended. "You didn't have to stay so long," Turok said as she joined him by the hearth, the fire casting soft light across the room. "He needed someone," Clara replied, folding her hands in her lap. Turok's eyes met hers, unguarded for the first time. "So did I." By midsummer, the San Pedro Valley shimmered under a relentless sun, the air thick with the scent of sage and baked earth. Clara had settled into the rhythm of the adobe, her hands no longer trembling as she ground corn or swept the floor. She coaxed a small garden back to life behind the house, where Liana's neglected rows had gone to weed. With patient fingers, she nurtured beans and squash from the stubborn soil, watering them from a clay jug Turok filled each morning. He watched her sometimes from the corral, not lingering, just pausing as he worked with the horses, his dark eyes catching hers in brief, Unspoken moments. One morning, after Cale woke with a fever and a cough that made his chest heave, Clara sat by his bed, cooling his forehead with damp cloths. She hummed softly, her voice steady despite the worry in her chest. Moreau sat on the floor, carving shapes into a stick, his small face tight with concern. Turok stepped inside, his shoulders heavy with the weight of memory. "Should I ride for the healer?" he asked, voice low. Clara kept her eyes on Cale. "Not yet. I've seen worse." Turok exhaled, trusting her. "You've nursed sick children before?" She shook her head. "My sister, until the end. I know when a fever turns dangerous." He brought more water, boiled cloths, and waited outside the room, his hands restless until Clara called him back. By evening, Cale's fever eased, his breathing steady. Clara stayed until he slept, his hand clutching the quilt she'd patched. "You didn't have to stay with him so long," Turok said as she joined him by the hearth, the firelight softening the lines of his face. "He needed someone," Clara said, her hands folding in her lap. Turok's gaze softened. "So did I." For the first time, Clara's expression held no trace of caution, no worry about her place. She looked at him openly, her voice quiet but sure. "You said marriage could wait. Do you still want to?" Turok turned to her, his eyes steady. "I wanted you to feel this is home." She smiled faintly. "It's starting to." He reached across the space between them, taking her hand. His palm was rough, warm, steady. He didn't squeeze, just held it there. The next morning, they told the boys. Cale grinned wide, his eyes bright despite his lingering weakness. Moreau blinked up from his blanket and asked, "Does that mean you're our ma now?" Clara leaned down, kissing his forehead. "Yes, little one. I'm staying." They married a week later under the cottonwood by the stream, its leaves whispering in the breeze. Sani, an older Apache woman from a nearby camp, brought cornbread and a woven shawl dyed with cochineal. The boys tossed sage blossoms at Clara's feet, their laughter echoing. Turok's vows were quiet, spoken in Apache and then English, each word deliberate and true. Clara's braid was woven with wildflowers, and her smile, though small, was unguarded. That night, after the boys slept and the fire burned low, Turok and Clara sat on a blanket under the stars. The air was warm, the valley alive with the hum of crickets. Clara leaned into his side, her head resting near his shoulder. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said softly. Turok brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "Neither am I." By late August, the San Pedro Valley softened, the air carrying the scent of dry pine and wild mint. The adobe hummed with life, Cale's chatter, Moreau's songs, Clara's quiet footsteps as she moved through her task. The garden flourished under her care, beans climbing stakes and squash spreading wide. Turok had patched the corral fence, and the root cellar brimmed with jars Clara had boiled and sealed. Cholla buds, prickly pear syrup, dried herbs. The boys had started calling her Ma, without prompting, their voices weaving her into their world. Turok rose before dawn again, not to outrun grief but to meet the day with a quiet steadiness. He walked the valley, checking traps, his boots leaving faint prints in the dust. One morning, he returned with a letter clenched in his fist, the paper damp from his palm. Clara was at the table, teaching Cale to write his name on the slate Turok had carved. Moreau sat beneath, stacking flat stones into wobbly towers. Turok handed her the letter without a word, its tight, slanted script unfamiliar. Clara opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the page. "My aunt passed," she said after a moment. "She raised me after my parents died. Left me a small shop in Missouri, near the river." Turok pulled a chair beside her, sitting close. "You want to go back?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't want it, but I should go. Settle it, sign the papers, see it once more. I won't stay." Turok studied her, his gaze steady. "We'll go together. You're my wife. The boys are ours now. They don't stay behind." It took 2 weeks to prepare. Sani agreed to tend the garden and horses, her sharp eyes softening as she wished them well. Turok traded a woven blanket for rail passage from Tucson. The boys had never seen a train. Cale sketched its wheels in the dirt, shouting at each whistle, while Moreau pressed his face to the window, mesmerized. In Missouri, the shop was smaller than Clara remembered, dusty shelves, a sagging roof, the hum of the river nearby. A neighbor brought a jar of pickled beets and said her aunt had grown quiet in her final years, staring west from the porch. Clara walked the shop once, touching a worn counter where she'd stitched as a girl. At the courthouse, they signed the papers, Tarak standing behind her, his hand light on her back. She gave the shop to the neighbor's son, a young man starting a family. She always looked west, the neighbor said, clutching the deed. Clara nodded, glancing at Tarak. I think she missed open sky. They returned to Arizona in early September, the valley's mesquite just starting to yellow. The boys raced to the adobe, shouting to the horses like long-lost friends. Sonny had kept everything in order, though she left a note about a goat chewing through a fence. That night, after unpacking and tucking the boys in, Clara stood by the window, gazing at the land that had become hers by choice. I thought going back would stir something, she said softly. Tarak traced the curve of her shoulder. Did it? She turned, her eyes clear. It made me certain I'll never leave this place again. He stepped closer, drawing her into a quiet kiss, deep and full, like the valley after a rare rain. By the first frost, the San Pedro Valley settled into a crisp quiet, the air sharp with the scent of cedar and cooling earth. Clara taught the boys letters at the kitchen table each morning, her voice patient as she guided Cale's hand across the slate and laughed when Moreau drew stars instead of words. Tarak joined when he could, reading from a tattered book of Apache stories Sonny had given him, though Cale groaned they were too long, but always stayed to hear the end. Tarak built a bench under the cottonwood where they'd married, its wood smoothed by his hands. Every Sunday they sat there after supper, the boys sprawling in the grass, chasing fireflies or tossing pebbles into the stream. Clara's head rested on Tarak's shoulder, her hand finding his. One evening, he whispered, "Never thought I'd feel whole again." She laced her fingers through his, her voice soft. Sometimes it just takes a new season. When spring returned, the garden bloomed richer than before, rows of beans, squash, and new patches of corn swaying under Clara's care. Cale's writing had steadied, his letters no longer wobbling, and Moreau could tie his own moccasins, grinning proudly each time. Clara was expecting, her belly just beginning to show. Sonny, visiting with a basket of dried sage, studied her and declared it would be a girl, from the way you carry. They named her Lila, a name that felt like it belonged to the valley. The adobe grew louder, fuller, but never rushed. Lila's first cries joined Cale's stories and Moreau's songs, blending with the clatter of clay pots and the crackle of the hearth. Tarak carved a cradle, his knife steady, and Clara wove a small blanket for it, her stitches tight and even. Every day moved at the pace of shared work, mending fences, kneading dough, teaching the boys to track footprints in the dust. In the silences between, love lived, not loud or showy, but steady, in every glance, every small gesture, every promise kept point. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the valley gold, Clara stood by the garden, Lila cradled against her shoulder. Tarak joined her, his arms slipping around her waist. The boys ran through the field, their laughter carrying on the breeze. "This is enough," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tarak nodded, his hand warm against her. More than enough. And in the quiet of the valley, under the wide Arizona sky, their home stood full, not perfect, but whole, built on hands that worked together and hearts that no longer feared the silence.